Hey everyone, welcome. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this explainer today. We're going to unpack, well, over 2 millennia of history. It's wild. We're going to see exactly how a vital Silk Road crossroads evolved into the modern, independent state of Uzbekistan. This is just a massive story of incredible resilience, of empires rising and falling, and honestly, of a culture that literally rebuilds itself from the ashes time and time again.
Now, think about the paradox here for a second. How exactly did a region completely dominated by harsh, arid expanses and vast deserts become the absolute wealthiest center of the ancient world? I mean, Uzbekistan doesn't exactly have endless fertile plains, right? It's completely landlocked. And yet somehow it became the beating heart, the absolute epicenter of global commerce and culture. So how did that happen? Well, that's exactly what we're going to figure out.
Okay, so here's the game plan for our journey. We'll trace 6 key eras. First, the ancient Silk Road. 2, Islam and the Golden Age. 3, the Mongols and the Timurids. 4, Russian and Soviet rule. 5, the road to independence. And finally 6, modern Uzbekistan's horizon. And our anchor through all of this, the thing to keep in mind, is this recurring theme of total destruction and remarkable rebirth.
All right, let's dive right into Section 1, the ancient Silk Road, crossroads of civilizations.
So let's trace the timeline and see how this all builds up. Now, human presence here actually goes back deep into the Paleolithic, but by 3000 BC, we're seeing the Bactria-Margiana Bronze Age culture setting up these really complex urban centers. And the sources show us how this fertile ground just became incredibly prized territory. By the 7th century BC, the mighty Persian Achaemenid Empire sweeps in, integrates the region, and completely transforms its economic structure. Then fast forward a bit to 334 BC, and boom, it's conquered by Alexander the Great. What this means is that, thanks to these back-to-back conquests, the region was constantly absorbing all these new administrative and cultural ideas from some of history's most massive empires.
And look, historical accounts make it super clear that this wasn't just some, dusty transit route for heavy camel caravans. The region, which was historically known as Transoxiana, actually became this flourishing center of globalized trade and cultural exchange. Like cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, they weren't just ancient truck stops. No way. They were massive metropolises, literally bursting with wealth, industry, and a ton of intellectual vigor.
Moving on to Section 2, Islam and the Golden Age, a cultural renaissance.
Okay, a really crucial historical point here is how the local populations actually absorbed Islamic influences brought by 7th century trade and Arab conquests. Because Islam didn't just wipe out and replace what was already there. Instead, the local people blended it with over 2 millennia of pre-Islamic heritage. It's like a giant cultural mixing pot. They adopted Arab and Persian languages for their literature and science, which basically sparked this magnificent intellectual golden age. Samarkand and Bukhara became major cultural hubs, essentially equals to Baghdad. This ushered in just a breathtaking era of Muslim science, art, and that jaw-dropping, brilliant blue-tiled architecture that, amazingly, still stands today.
Which brings us to Section 3, Mongols and the Timurids, devastation and rebirth. Now consider this stark contrast, because it's pretty mind-blowing. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan's invasion was, quite frankly, an apocalyptic event. The sources describe these completely devastated agricultural systems and cities just laid to waste overnight. Centuries of civilization were basically erased. Yet, incredibly, just over a century later, this Turco-Mongol chieftain named Timur, you might know him as Tamerlane, rises to power. And he brilliantly, though definitely ruthlessly, conquers this massive empire, stretching from Russia all the way to India. Then he brings all the best artisans from across the world right back to his capital in Samarkand, rebuilding the region into an absolute cultural jewel. So you have this total, utter destruction, followed almost immediately by an unparalleled architectural and artistic rebirth. It's a true phoenix moment.
To really understand this cultural resilience on a more, human level, let's step away from the warlords for a second and think about ikat textiles. The Timurid era saw the absolute peak of Central Asian textile art. And guys, these weren't just everyday clothes. They were these splendid, incredibly brightly colored silk, warp, and velvet robes. They featured these wildly complex geometrical patterns. They were basically visual status symbols, carefully woven to convey powerful messages of fertility, splendor, and massive wealth.
There's a quote from the sources that compares these luxury fabrics to flowers filled with honey. I just love that. It totally transforms what could just be a dry historical artifact into something incredibly vivid and tangible, right? It just perfectly hits the nail on the head, capturing the vibrant, enduring spirit of a people who continuously created such beauty out of a really harsh landscape in a seriously turbulent history.
So, following the Timurids, the region kind of fragmented. The sources detail how power eventually settled into three distinct competing entities: the Uzbek Khanates of Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand. Bukhara, established in the 16th century, actually absorbed Samarkand and stayed this major cultural and Islamic center. Meanwhile, Khiva, with its super-ancient roots, controlled the western territory, and Kokand emerged as a key player a bit later in the 18th century. Now, these Khanates governed Central Asia for centuries, very deeply entrenched in their traditional ways of life. Well, until a rapidly expanding power from the north decided to set its sights on them.
And that brings us to Section 4, Russian and Soviet rule, incorporation and transformation.
This part of the timeline maps out a really rapid, pretty much total loss of autonomy. Starting around 1867, the Russian Empire, which is hungry for resources and strategic buffers, began systematically incorporating those khanates. Fast forward past the 1917 Russian Revolution, and the whole region gets folded directly into the Soviet system. This culminates in the formation of the Uzbek SSR in 1924, and by the 1930s, the Soviets were undertaking massive, full-scale industrialization all across the republic.
Now, it is absolutely fascinating to see exactly how the Soviets engineered the borders of Central Asia, because this was highly strategic. They definitely didn't draw lines to preserve any sort of historical or cultural heritage. Actually, scratch that, it was the exact opposite. They actively sought to disrupt homogeneity. By drawing these totally arbitrary borders, they intentionally split Uzbek tribes across new neighboring republics. This effectively severed deep historical, economic, and agricultural lifelines, basically ensuring that these new republics had to remain completely dependent on Moscow rather than uniting together against it. So we see this really profound duality during this era. On one hand, sure, the Soviet era brought massive, rapid modernization, huge urbanization, and railroad construction. But on the other hand, this all came at just a staggering cultural and human cost. The economy was aggressively shifted to monoculture farming. We're talking almost exclusively cotton. Plus, there was this intense forced suppression of both ethnic nationalism and religion. They even went so far as to impose an entirely new alphabet. And the sources specifically note this was a calculated move designed to actively disconnect the population from all their pre-Soviet literary and religious texts.
All right, moving into Section 5, the road to independence, forging a new state.
August 31, 1991. This date marked a truly monumental pivot. Following the absolute collapse of the Soviet Union, Uzbekistan officially declared its independence. I mean, think about it. It was this sudden, almost overnight end to decades of Soviet rule. And it abruptly left the local leadership with the incredibly massive responsibility of basically building a sovereign nation entirely from scratch.
The immediate hurdles here were just staggering. Think about what they were facing. They had to completely break away from a tightly controlled, highly centralized Soviet economy that they'd relied on for like 70 years. They had to create entirely new government and legal structures out of thin air, establish a brand new currency, and somehow transition to a market economy. And they had to do the whole shebang while trying to maintain social stability, completely without the massive safety net of those old Soviet subsidies.
Which leads us perfectly into our final section, Section 6, Modern Uzbekistan's Horizon, Reforms and Challenges.
Now, unfortunately, the environmental bill for that old Soviet mandate for cotton monoculture, well, it's really come due. Today, a staggering 88% of groundwater is still being used just for irrigation. And to put that in perspective, this exact practice is what drained the rivers feeding the Aral Sea, leading to literally one of the world's worst ecological disasters. It caused severe land degradation and desertification, which is a massive crisis that Uzbekistan is desperately trying to reverse today.
Politically speaking, the current landscape is a super delicate balancing act. So after decades of strict autocratic rule following independence, there was a major transition of power in 2016 to Shavkat Mirziyoyev. And this actually brought an unprecedented wave of liberalization and economic reform. There is just this palpable demand for change from the public right now. However, as the sources point out, this political thaw still wrestles with some really deep-seated issues. The government has had to actively work to dismantle systemic forced labor in agriculture, specifically in those cotton fields, and they're constantly having to balance their push for economic openness against a lingering legacy of persistent authoritarianism.
2,500. That is an enormous number. That number represents the years of turbulent, documented history that this land has survived. From the earliest ancient settlements to the present day, this region has absorbed the impacts of the Persians, the Greeks, the Arabs, the Mongols, the Russians, and the Soviets. And you know what? Through all of that, they have somehow forged a completely singular, incredibly enduring identity.
So I want to leave you with this final thought. Uzbekistan has survived some of the absolute most dramatic upheavals in human history, always rebuilding,
always adapting. As we look to the future, we really have to ask, how exactly will a nation defined by its ability to outlast empires navigate this delicate balance of modern reform and environmental preservation? How will the phoenix of the Silk Road rise to meet the challenges of the 21st century? Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.